Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's edition of Forum Conversations. Hope you're having a very good afternoon, morning, or perhaps even evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Damien Shand, and myself and my colleague Hannah Marshall from the JSTOR Forum team will be talking with Marta Chudolinska, who is Ontario College of Art and Design University's Learning Zone librarian. And as you know, and as you're very excited about, I'm sure, we're talking about the wonderful Zine collection that they have. So once again, thank you very much for coming. And without any further ado, over to Hannah and Marta.
All right, thank you, Damien. So I thought that we would get started by just kind of explaining what zines are for anybody who isn't familiar with them. And Marta, I'm going to turn to you to kind of do a quick overview of what makes something a zine, where they come from, and what people are referring to when they talk about zine culture.
Sure. So the definition of a zine is a bit nebulous, so you'll get maybe a different definition for every person who gives you one, but generally I define a zine as a printed, self-published, or micro-published booklet. So yeah, it's a publication usually in the form of a booklet. By micro-published, I mean there's usually, there might be more than one person involved in the publishing, but it's going to be a very small group of people. Zines usually have some handmade properties, and they're also defined by the distribution. So they're usually distributed by the creators or by micro-distributors at fairs, in person or online, sometimes in stores. And by micro-distributors, I mean any kind of entity that's run by a small group, often just one person, that purchases zines from creators and then distributes them out to the broader world. I would say that maybe 30 years ago, you could say pretty definitively what a typical zine looked like. It would be something that was, you know, a soft cover publication, didn't have a spine, it was photocopied, folded, and stapled. But since that time, because the cost of printing for the consumer has decreased substantially, we're seeing a much bigger range of format and quality of production. So zines are printed in color, they have special folds, cutouts, different kinds of hand printing. So for me, the defining characteristics of zines is more about the scale of production and distribution rather than the format and subject matter. Yeah, so the typical sort of print run of a zine will be anywhere from like 20 copies to 300 copies, and a successful zine might be reprinted several times and go into 1,000 copies, but you're really not going to see much higher print runs than that.
Okay, and are they associated with a specific time period? Like, is there a date where they first started appearing, or are they a longer run than that?
Again, that kind of depends who you ask and what their perspective on zines is. I see zines as being connected back to self-publishing, back to like the first like tabletop presses. You know, hundreds of years ago. Zines are often sort of tied into the 1970s, where there was a movement of sci-fi fanzines. So there were these sci-fi pulp magazines, which had varying qualities of writing, and the fans decided that they could write better stories, so they started publishing their own zines. They're also really connected to the punk scene, with the sort of DIY ethos behind them. They're really connected to 90s and, oh, I'm blanking on the name, but like Bikini Kill and basically like this movement of feminist musicians and creators. So it kind of depends how broad of a definition you want to give zines, but basically there's been lots of little pockets of subcultures that have used zines to share their own interests or share politics or share, you know, creative endeavors like writing or art or comics throughout the past, you know, definitely the past 50 years, but it could go back much farther than that.
Okay, and that the term zine, when did that term come into use? Was that sort of in the 70s around the fanzines that you were talking about?
Yeah, to my knowledge, that's when it started being used.
Okay.
I'm not like a perfect zine historian, but yeah, that's my impression.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So how do you draw any distinction between what makes something a zine and when it becomes an artist's book? Because I feel like a lot of people who might be on the call and people who work in Forum have collections of artist books, which they're sort of familiar with, and they are similarly hard to define and kind of range in format and scope in a way that I think is really similar to zines.
Sure. So I think, again, that line between zines and artist books was probably a lot easier to draw, 25, 30 years ago.
Right.
And the distinction has become a lot less clear. Again, for me, the difference lies in the production, the size of the print run, and also the intended audience. So zines are made for sale to individuals who expect to pay between like $1 to maybe $20 at most for an item. So the production levels involved with that are kind of considered in terms of like what the price point is in terms of selling it. And zines are also still function in like a trade economy. So if you go to a zine fair, you'll often be trading zines with other people rather than buying them.
Oh, okay.
Maybe produced with that in mind. And then zines kind of have handmade elements, but I find that most zines, even when they have handmade elements, they're still incorporating some form of commercial printing. So it's sort of like the price of production is really considered. For artist books, I generally think they weigh more heavily on handmade production, on using artist quality and acid-free materials, and a much smaller edition size. That being said, there's definitely items in our collection that could easily be described as artist books, or at least straddle the line in between them. We have a class here at OCAD that is a class about publications and artist multiples. So students have to visit the zine library and they make multiples, and then they have to make one to donate to the library. So there's certain things from that coursework where it really straddles that line. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's really, if it's donated to the zine collection and it's not a mass publication, we will generally accept it and treat it as a zine. So I think because the definition of zines is so nebulous, there should be some agency granted to the creators to decide whether or not they consider it a zine.
Okay, that makes sense. If it qualifies as a zine if somebody's calling it a zine.
Yeah, pretty much, which is not a great definition by library standards, but it is what it is.
No, but it's a helpful definition. So you kind of alluded to the collection of zines that you guys have there at OCAD, and I feel like before we get into the collection and sort of its strengths and how it circulates and how you've used Forum to put the catalog online, I want to talk a little bit about where it's situated, so the learning zone specifically, because this is a really unique space, and I think your role there is incredibly unique, and you wear lots of different hats, and talking about the project will make a lot more sense for people when they understand sort of the context where you work. So can you talk a little bit about what the learning zone is and what your role involves?
Sure. So the learning zone is a kind of an experiment in a studio-based library space. So it kind of brings together the model of an info commons. It also has collections, but then it also has just a lot of open space and flexible furniture on wheels that can be moved around so that we can orient the space to have a huge range of activities in there. So it's definitely like a home for library programming. So we have different workshops in the space. We have exhibitions. We also bring in other departments to offer services and drop-ins in the space because it is a space that students use. So we're trying to bring services to them rather than the other way around. So students can use this space for kind of a variety of purposes. Obviously, the typical kind of study space that you would expect in a library. We have computers and scanners and printers. They can also do studio work as long as it doesn't require special ventilation or has any sort of toxic properties. And there tends to be used for students meeting in groups. Sometimes students meet with faculty members there because it's a bit more of an informal environment. We have a bunch of different student groups or student clubs on campus that also meet in the space. So it's really quite a huge range of events and activities that we have in the space. For a couple of years, we have our creative writing classes at the end of each term have a poetry reading event that's like brings in 100 people from classes and family and friends and stuff like that. So it's kind of like a massive community space at OCAD. Partially, I think, because it's a space that is staffed, so it's kind of supported and taken care of, and also it's a space that's interdisciplinary. So because it's part of the library, it doesn't belong to any one department, so it allows for a lot of this kind of like cross-fertilization between people.
And you said it's physically located in the ground floor of the building where the library is also located, right? So it's sort of become like the gathering place, and then the library has become the quiet study area. Is that right?
Yeah, so that was one of the challenges the library had before this space was opened was, the library has a couple of individual study rooms where groups can meet, but those get taken up quite quickly. So there was always this friction between students meeting in the library and wanting to talk, mostly for group projects, and then students wanting the library to be kind of like this absolute quiet place. And funnily enough, it was like students shushing each other as opposed to the librarian stereotype of shushing. So that has sort of provided us, opening the learning zone provided us with a solution to that problem. So the learning zone, you can talk, you can listen to music, you can eat food, you can drink drinks, whatever. There's not the same sort of restrictions, so it becomes a more engaged library space, and the library is more of the quiet zone.
Right, okay. And then, so you mentioned that one of the other distinctions is that unlike other common areas on campus, the learning zone is actually staffed. So can you talk about your staff and your role in the space?
Sure. So the staff, including myself, we have 2.5 full-time staff members in the space. And then we have a staff of usually up to 10 students. So we're open during the fall and winter terms. We're open, evenings throughout the week. We're open Saturdays. So we have at least 2 staff members working in the space at all times. And I think that provides a lot of help to the students. Our student staff is really invaluable, not just in like shelf reading and maintaining the collections, but also assisting students. So it's one of the few places that you can get software help. So there's some computer labs, but they're not staffed. So a student might be struggling with something in Photoshop. In the learning zone, there's always someone you can ask. Or if you're dealing with something else, there's always someone you can ask who can refer to you and tell you about other services on campus. So I think having the staff there really benefits the students in the space. And then myself, I'm the learning zone librarian, so I manage the space. I work with 2 technicians, one who's there full-time and one half-time. So I basically work to kind of keep all these balls in the air. One of my technicians is a coordinator that deals with scheduling. So that's happened in recent years where some of the scheduling around the students I no longer have to worry about, but basically I'm scheduling the whole calendar of activities for the space. I'm running some of the workshops, I'm curating some of the exhibitions, and then also, managing the collections, including the zine library, and kind of making decisions to grow that collection and to make it more accessible.
Yeah, and so one of the things that you had mentioned is that the zine collection, it sort of lives entirely within this space and therefore is completely autonomous. So you do all of the collection development as well as all of the cataloging, and you manage the physical collection, which lives in the space. So you and your student staff and your assistants do all of the metadata creation, correct, for the zines?
Yes, the students not so much, but yeah, myself and the technicians, we do all of the cataloging in-house. I started working with the collection in 2009, so that was before I was in my present position, but that was when we started cataloging the collection. The collection was started in 2007 by a former student, so then in 2009, myself and another temporary library employee were working on basically continuing that student's work and starting the catalog for the collection. So at the time, we were sort of looking at all the various options for cataloging. I did a practicum here actually before I started working here, where I evaluated the different cataloging options and their pros and cons. So our decision to go with a custom cataloging system was really a lot based on the context of the library and what kind of resources, human and technical, et cetera, we had available. So, our cataloging staff for the library itself is quite small. They were already at the time dealing with a backlog of the official library, the library collection already was there's a lot of items to catalog in that collection. So adding this special collection into that mix would have really slowed down how quickly we could process the zines. And there's other considerations at play as well. So we decided to just create our own custom cataloging system and catalog the zines that way. So we started actually like reference interns who were first started cataloging the collection. And then once I started my job here as a Learning Zone librarian, it was myself and my technicians who were taking on that work.
And so just for some quick stats about the collection, how many physical items does it include at this point?
The zine collection, just over 2,500 zines are cataloged and on the shelf. And then we have about the equivalent of a backlog to be cataloged that are not yet on the shelf.
And so the contents of the actual collection that you have online, just so that I'm showing right now what it looks like in your actual forum project, and then people can access these on Shared Shelf Commons or as a public collection if they're logged into ArtStore. So what they're seeing here these are actually scans of the covers of each of the zines, and then there is a data record, which includes all of the descriptive information about the zine. But you can't actually access a full digital version of each piece online. It's meant purely to be sort of an online catalog of the collection. And so when you're saying that there are about 2,500 that are cataloged and on the shelf, those are represented here in the digital collection as a catalog to those, correct?
Yeah.
And so these, people can probably see as I'm sort of like mousing over these that there's a little, you can see the call number that's on the front of the cover, and then you've got these kind of like amazing scans of them, which are, they're really high quality images of the covers, which is sort of more than I would have expected given that they're just guides to the collection. But so how many do you have that are not represented in the public version of the collection? Like what's that backlog that you were alluding to?
Yeah, the backlog is about like just like over 2,000 zines as well.
Okay. All right. So oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that in the process of migrating to JSTOR Forum, we took a full year to clean up our cataloging before we migrated everything. So that's where that backlog comes from. We wanted to make sure that we fixed any errors in the catalog before making it public. Yeah. That's what you see Doc Hillis, that's our archivist who uploaded our original spreadsheets into JSTOR Forum after they were cleaned up.
Right. I feel like every migration story has like a backlog that piled up in the background while you were doing the work of actually moving content. So there's the physical collection is sort of non-circulating, right? It lives in that in this physical space and people can access the copies here. But then you also have, one of the things I thought was interesting is that you're always adding to the collection and you accept donations. And one of the things that I'm sure anybody who's done collection development knows is that donations always result in duplicates. So you also mentioned that you have this collection that you call, I think, the roaming collection. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so at some point we used to catalog duplicates. We used to include them on the shelf. At a certain point, we decided that as the collection was growing quite a bit, we were no longer going to do that. So we removed all the duplicates. And as we received donations, we would also set the duplicates aside. And our original intention was to donate them to other zine libraries. That being said, oftentimes the duplicates are things that are local and that other local zine libraries already have. So at some point we had this bag of duplicates, and we've had different requests over the years for us to bring zines to events, to orientation, to whatever else. So we have done that. We've brought items from the collection out of the space to different events. But at some point we realized that this collection of duplicates provided us an opportunity to create another collection of zines that could be brought to events without concern about, damage or loss to the main zine collection. So we have a collection called the Roaming Zine Collection. It has about, I think, 300 items in it now. It's grown really quickly. So those are not cataloged in the same way. They just have little labels that say OCAD Zine Library. And then we have a list of just the titles and the authors. That's just like a spreadsheet list. But yeah, it's great. It's something that we can just bring around and share with our community without really concern for the maintenance of the collection.
Yeah, and I noticed actually in the cataloging form in this project, you have this status field, which indicates, like this one, for example, is listed as being on the shelf. Yeah. Is the roaming collection reflected in this list? No, it looks like.
No, so the roaming collection is just not incorporated into the JSTOR Forum collection at all.
Okay, got it. Yeah. All right, so I want to talk really quickly just about this cataloging form that we're looking at, because the field set that you're using here is actually, it's a customized metadata schema that's specifically for the description of zines. Can you talk a little bit about, I think it's called Zine Core, right?
Yeah, it's an adaptation of Zine Core. Okay. So in 2011, I was able to attend the Zine Librarians Unconference. That's held every July, and it roams around through various different U.S. cities. It was in Milwaukee when I went to it, but the Zine Librarian Unconference is organized by a group of Zine librarians that have a Yahoo group. Yes, Yahoo groups. But yeah, it's a great conference. Everyone gets together. It's a range of people who work in academic libraries, public libraries, and other people who manage zine libraries that are not in a library at all. So at the conference, we generate ideas of what we want to talk about, and then we organize that into a schedule of sessions. One of those sessions was about zine cataloging. And in that session, we established Zine Core, which is kind of loosely based on the Dublin Core metadata standard. With the idea that if we were all cataloging in a way that could be mapped to a common metadata standard, that could be really useful in the future for when there is a zine union catalog, which is a project that's already being piloted right now. So the idea that zine collections could be brought together into one massive catalog. So after that conference, I took that information home, and I wanted to make sure that the way that we were cataloging was already in tune with Zine Core, and it was actually pretty much all mappable. We were already pretty comprehensive in terms of how many fields we had about each item. The only thing we had to add afterwards was synopsis, so kind of a description of what is in the zine. So that was another kind of big backlog project of going back and going through and writing synopses for all the zines. And that's right. the most challenging aspect of cataloging zines, other than choosing which category to put them in, is writing a synopsis that describes what the zine is about without being, using any language that has judgment or sort of evaluation of quality or anything like that. And
Right.
we also have tons and tons of art zines, being an art college, so there's just tons of zines that are just images. So writing a synopsis of, abstract images in a zine, that can be really challenging as well. But yeah, we're collecting, I think in one of the handouts for creating digital access, there's a photograph that I took of, not that I took, but there's a photograph of like the Zine core metadata standard as it was developed.
Right, and I just want to point people towards that. So in the GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see that there are these two downloadable PDFs, and those are both PDFs of presentations that Marta has given on this collection and the Learning Zone and the Zine collection specifically. And one of them includes sort of a breakdown of the metadata mapping that you did and that whole project. So if people are interested in following up with you or learning more about that, they should definitely check it out. It's really helpful. I love the whiteboard illustration where you're like doing all of the mapping. I feel like everyone's been in a room with a whiteboard that looks like that at some point. So one of the other things in the metadata for this project that I love is that you guys are also using, you were sort of alluding to how the synopsis can be this really challenging summary to do without being overly subjective or, reflecting your own biases or judgments about the piece, and that is always kind of like a touchy thing to do when you're doing descriptive cataloging. But one of the other things that I think can be super challenging, especially with visual material, is assigning subject terms, like identifying what something is of or about can be really hard sometimes. And you guys have this really amazing keyword list that that's loaded as a controlled list in Forum, and it's like hundreds of terms long, and they're all just these terms which I'm guessing are sort of specific to the collection, and they do not map cleanly to an existing controlled vocabulary, it looks like. And I'm wondering about the origin of this list.
Sure. So again, that was kind of a decision early on whether we were going to use the standard controlled vocabularies of, Library of Congress or whatever else, or if we're going to create our own system. I was really inspired. There's a zine library in Nova Scotia in Canada at the Robert Street Social Center called the Anchor Archive Zine Library. And they have an amazing blog they have a blog for the zine library, but they also have a blog about cataloging the zine library. If you're interested in zine cataloging or zines in general, it's a great resource to check out. So they actually created their own zine thesaurus for keywords. So I was pretty inspired by that. And then just thinking about some of the, potentially problematic nature of standardized subject headings. I mean, the great thing about working with standardized subject headings is they're already established. You can easily pull from things that have been standardized, but they're also very slow to change. So because zines are often very progressive in terms of their politics, it can be kind of hard to squish them into kind of LC subject headings. So, terminology for Indigenous people, terminology for people of color, terminology about sexuality, gender identity, these things can be kind of hard to describe without using a system that is kind of unfortunate, let's just say. So creating our own subject headings allowed us the freedom to be really adaptable in terms of how the zines were described. So yeah, the way that this list has been built has been basically from cataloging the zines and then looking at the existing things in the list and then adding things where it was required. I will say though, after like almost 10 years of creating the list that, there's certain times where I wish we had just used a standardized. It can be a lot of work for 3 people to create a controlled vocabulary. and keep it making sense. But ultimately, I think I'm glad we decided to go this way. It describes the zines, I think, in a way that is more true to the content.
Right. Yeah, and another thing that I feel like you've managed to capture that is really important to the zines and zine culture is that you're also, wherever possible, you've grabbed websites that are relevant to the artist that created the zines, sort of as a way of preserving that attribution, which I think is really great.
Yeah, there's certain things in the catalog that are not publicly viewable. So sometimes the zines will have information about, definitely older zines anyway, will have information about address, because the zine store would put their address in their zines, say, if you want the next issue of the zine, send me a letter with $2 and I will send you a letter back with the zine. That was a lot of the distribution system was mail-based. So people would be sharing PO boxes or addresses. Nowadays, you'll often get, websites or email addresses or stuff like that. But generally, any address or email or price information, we don't make public. That's just for our personal use if we choose, if we decide that we want to reorder a zine that's gone missing or went damaged or something like that. I actually can't remember if the website is public either. I think it might be set to private view, just because websites change so often that it would just create a lot of content in our catalog that might be out of date.
Right, that makes sense. And then you've also got, I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the things that is captured in the presentations that are attached to the go-to is that there are 13, I think it's 13 categories in the collection, right? Can you talk a little bit about how you settled on those categories and give examples of a few of them?
Sure. So the categories are based on the structure that was started by the student who started the collection. So Alicia Nada was a former OCAD student. She is an artist and printmaker in Toronto, still working in Toronto, still making zines in Toronto. So she started, she had a job in the library that was a sort of student liaison job that is a position where a student works to connect the library to the student body. So they have like 100 hours over the course of a fall and winter to do whatever they want, really, with not whatever they want, but they can propose projects with those 100 hours. And her project was the zine library. So she established the categories. I believe the ones she established were art, comics, info DIY, music, politics, poetry, queer zines. I think that might have been it. Since then, we have added a few more categories. So before we had the catalog publicly available, everything was accessible via shelf browsing. So once you get, over 1,000 zines, having 8 categories doesn't really cut it anymore. So we started adding new categories to sort of help improve the shelf access and the browsing of the zines. So we ended up adding a category for per-zines. So that's kind of a custom genre for zines, kind of short for personal zines. So these are zines that are sort of like diary zines, narrative, like personal narratives. We added a category for OCAD U. So those are zines that are made from OCAD student groups or OCAD courses. And then we also added one for fashion. And one for sex and sexuality.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about the student groups? Because I know that there's a group called the OCAD Zine Collective that's represented in the collection, and it's a really interesting organization, and their way of working is very interesting to me, and I think it's a great example of outreach that you've done with the collection.
Sure, so the Zine Collective is a student group. In our institution, anyone can start a student group as long as it has 5 student members. And faculty and staff are welcome to be part of student groups, but there still needs to be this core of students. So I started the group in 2011. I was just starting to work in pretty much when I was starting to work in my role as a learning zone librarian. So like Alicia, who started the collection, I was aware that there was a lot of people at the school making zines, but they weren't necessarily connected. So one of her motivations for starting the collection was to bring these people together. And one of my motivations for starting the group was to get these people together as well. So I knew that, in the printmaking department, there was going to be some people making zines and maybe drawing and painting. And then in graphic design and illustration, there would be people making zines. I make zines, and I'm tapped into the Toronto zine community, so I just knew that there were students making zines. So I thought if we had a zine collective, that could be an opportunity to bring those people together and share information and make things together. What I've found over the years is that the group doesn't attract those people for whatever reason. People who are already making zines are comfortable with what they know. I mean, it attracts some of those people, but primarily it seems to attract people who have never made a zine or have been involved in making one zine but are interested in getting in learning more. So it kind of has become this really great group for sharing knowledge about zines and people who are excited or interested kind of getting their feet wet and learning. So the images there are from some of the zine library workshops that I run. So yeah, basically we have workshops every year, sometimes every semester, that teach students certain skills. So screen printing, bookbinding. I have a workshop this year that I started, which is Intro to Self-Publishing, that kind of covers a lot of different aspects of planning a publication, different ways you could print it. So through the workshops, students can kind of develop these skills. We also do a collaborative zine every year. So for the past several years, we've been doing that. So that's also a really great way to engage students who are interested in zines but not quite confident in making their own work. I often find that once someone makes one zine, it's like they're off to the races and they're so excited about the zines, they're making zines. But just to get over that hump of making that first publication can be really, really difficult. So working on a collaborative project, I feel like, is a really great gateway for that. So when we do the collaborative projects, we put out a call to the whole university at large. We get submissions, and then the students work together to put together the submissions into an InDesign document, and then we print it. In recent years, we've been printing on the risograph machine available in the printmaking department, and then we make it available to students. So because it's a student group, we can apply for grant funding from the student union. So that's how we've been able to do these collaborative projects. So they provide us the funding, we print the zines, and then we give the zines away for free at the OCAD Zine Fair.
Oh, that's a nice twist that they're free.
Yeah, they kind of have to be free. I think we would prefer to sell them for $2 and kind of fundraise for other projects, but we're grateful that there is an organization that's supporting these, so it's fine to give them away for free.
Yeah, that is nice. And you mentioned earlier that there's also at least one assignment on campus where faculty have their students undertake a project that results in creating a zine, which they then have to donate to the library. Are there other examples where faculty are incorporating the zine collection or zine production into their coursework? Yeah,
so right now we actually have a summer course, which is a comics class. I think in the liberal arts and sciences, so it's kind of like an English class about comics. So I'm not sure exactly the details of the assignment, but we've had students visiting all this week and last week, and they have to find zines in the zine library to write about. So there's faculty members, who are assigning zines, kind of not specific zine readings, but are assigning students to come and visit the collection and engage with it. We have those classes from the publications program that come in. So for those classes, usually what happens is the class comes for a visit to the zine library. I show them 150 zines of all different sizes and colors to show them the breadth of zines and how people are using the medium. And then they go on, they make their assignment, and then they usually have to make maybe 10 or 15 copies of something, and one of those copies comes to the zine collection. We also have another college that there's an instructor there who brings their class to come visit our zine library. So they are also a comics class, and they have to write a zine review and draw a picture of the cover of the zine, and then they put all of those zine reviews together into a zine, which they then donate back to us. So it gets to be very like Inception in terms of the relations. But yeah, it's mostly publications, printmaking, comics classes. I'm hoping that with the catalog being online, we can sort of use that as an opportunity for outreach for more faculty members as well. And we are in the process of harvesting all the items in the collection from JSTOR Forum into our discovery layer. That's going to be a little bit more challenging than we expected, but hopefully by like the fall semester, we'll also have all the zines in our sum and discovery layer. So that will expand, like, you know, how many students find the zines, but also faculty members. Yeah.
Right. So the idea being that when students are just searching in your catalog, if a zine is relevant to their search, it'll be returned in the results, and they'll make their way over to the learning zone and discover. Like
the circle of my goals.
Yeah. Exactly. That's so. One thing that I thought was really interesting is that in addition to sort of having coursework hook into developing the collection in this way that you just described, where the students are generating zines, you actually also do active collection development, where you sort of identify gaps in the collection or weaknesses that you want to develop further, not weaknesses to develop, things that you want to make strengths within the collection. And you actively acquired new zines from fairs and from distributors, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, so you can see right now we have a very small pocket of funding that's allocated to us from the collections budget. In previous years, we've also done our own fundraising. So you can see on the screen at the Zine Fair, we have like a button making table. So we always do like one button free and then four for $1, and then we generate some fundraising for that, which we use to purchase zines. And we've had other little pockets of funding in the past. So yeah, so whenever I have funds to purchase zines, I use those to purchase things that I find we're not getting enough representation reflected through donations. So in the past, we did some kind of targeted purchasing of zines from the queer community to kind of build up that particular category. This year and for the next few years to come, my focus is on purchasing zines by Indigenous peoples about Indigenous issues and any sort of zines about decolonization, so zines by people of color, about issues of decolonization. We have a new academic plan at the institution where indigenization and decolonization are major priorities. So I want the zine, not just because of the academic plan, obviously, but I want the collection to reflect that. And definitely in Canada, there is a big focus on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and how that's actually being playing out is kind of questionable from a government perspective, but I feel like it's a responsibility of every Canadian person who's benefiting from, you know, the wealth of Canada as a country to educate themselves about Indigenous issues. So adding Indigenous content to the zine collection is a great way of doing that.
Yeah, I think that's great. And so when you set out to find that kind of material, how it sounds like you're in a nice position in that Toronto has a very active zine culture, but how do you go about finding zines to add to the collection that fit these criteria when you're trying to build up a certain area?
So yeah, so definitely being in Toronto, we're very privileged. We have probably, I don't know, like at least 5 zine fairs throughout the year, probably more. For the past several years, there's a Toronto Queer Zine Fair. There's an Asian Zine Fair that just started this past year. So, you know, unfortunately, the zine community still tends to be very white, but that's kind of changing, and you're seeing these communities mobilizing to bring more attention to underrepresented voices. So yeah, I've attended zine fairs in Toronto to purchase. Because I'm a zine maker and I attend zine fairs to sell my own stuff, that also provides me with opportunity to visit other places. So there's another town kind of an hour away where I've gone for zine fairs. I've gone to Montreal, different places in the States. So if I, see something that I think would be good for the collection, I'll buy it. There's certain shops that you can find things. If you're close to Chicago, there's Quimby's, which is an amazing zine and comic book store. But yeah, a lot of this stuff ends up being purchased online. When I have that specific focus, you may not necessarily find it in a zine fair, or you'll find just like a small portion of it represented in a zine fair. So I'll look if there's particular writers or creators or artists that I'm already familiar with, I'll just specifically try to find their websites. But I've just also searched, Google search. I've searched on Etsy, where a lot of people are selling their work. Yeah, so sometimes it has to be just looking out there in the greater world. Sometimes you'll find these kind of articles that are like 5 zine creators. So then bookmarking and saving that kind of stuff when it comes time to purchase zines. And then just, following people who are writing about these issues in general, that can kind of open you up to other writers and creators.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it means that a lot of money gets spent on shipping, but I think I would rather build the collection with quality content and lose that shipping money than just not have it at all.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess because the internet must have made building a zine collection so much easier than when everything was being done by actual correspondence mail when you were writing to producers to send you a copy of the zine. It must be so much easier to kind of scan that landscape quickly and find creators and jumping off from there, because they all have their own websites, and that must be a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, there was always distros, so there was always people who were buying zines wholesale from other creators and kind of using their audience or notoriety to bring attention to other people. There was Factsheet 5 and Zinophile. There was kind of zines of zines, so zines with zine reviews and different information of where you could order stuff from people. My impression is that it was just a much smaller community, so it was easier maybe to be aware of things that were going on, whereas right now you kind of need the internet because there's just this explosion of self-publishing, and it's kind of impossible to keep up with everything that's going on.
Yeah, that's understandable. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left in the hour, and I really want to give people a chance to ask questions. So feel free to submit your questions into that little questions box that's in the control panel. Right off the bat, we have one that's asking if you have more information about the Asian Zine Fair that you just mentioned.
1 second.
We can also send it in the file.
Last year. Oh yeah. So it was November 2017.
And was that in Toronto?
That was in Toronto, yeah.
Okay.
So it was held at the Transat Club, which is another space that has a zine library. So the Toronto Zine Library is located there.
Okay. And I do want to say to Anne, who asked that question, and anybody else, in the handouts that are downloadable, Marta's contact information is on the last slide of both of those presentations. So if you have specific questions like that about anything that she's mentioned, feel free to get in touch with her directly afterwards if there's something that we can't cover in the Q&A.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also, there's organizations that are supporting different kinds of communities pretty much in every city. So if there's an organization that you're aware of that does advocacy for a particular community, you could contact them and be like, hey, what if you guys organize a zine fair? The zine fair is not that challenging to put together. So if there's something that you would like to see happen in your local area, I think there's ways of making it happen without too much of a challenge.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. There's a question that's asking, what, if any, are your plans to digitize and make zines available online? So I'm assuming the question has to do with digitizing the zines in your actual collection.
Right. So when we started cataloging the zines, I think we started scanning the covers in maybe 2011. So kind of long before we had a platform selected, we were already scanning the covers. Before that happened, I had a pretty in-depth conversation with our visual resources and special collections librarian. So all of the scanning for the covers has happened through our visual resources department, which has been a really great and supportive collaboration. You were saying earlier that like the images are really great quality. That's because they have, their image standards that they maintain for creating images for the instructional image collection. So they've applied those for zines. When we were deciding whether we were going to scan the covers, our VR librarian was kind of concerned even just about the covers because of issues of copyright. So the way that we dealt with that was just making sure that we put a really clear takedown notice in all of the catalog records. When that discussion was happening, I reached out to Milo Miller from QZAP, which is the Queer Zine Archive Project, which is based out of Milwaukee. So they're an online collection that scans the entire zine and makes it available. We haven't gone that route, partially because of concerns about copyright. Obviously, zine creators, we should respect their copyright. There's also a thing I find that a lot of our collection is quite contemporary. So we do have some things going back to like the 80s and 90s, but a lot of the collection has grown from just since the time that the zine collection started. So a lot of them are from the past 10, 15 years. So there's a lot of content in there from zines that people are still, actively selling. When you think about sort of concerns about copyright, a lot like copyright basically comes down to, are you impinging on someone's ability to make money from their intellectual property? And I think by digitizing the whole zine, that's definitely kind of crossing that line. If it was maybe more of a historical collection, I think there could be a better argument for it, in that, these things aren't available in any other place. QZAP justifies it that, these are resources that are really valuable to researchers and the community. But I think for us, because it's such a contemporary collection and because we definitely can't afford a lawsuit, it's just not a priority. For us, the priority is, having the zines catalog and having the covers there to give people a sense of what the zine is like. Would I like to see it fully scanned and available online? Like, yeah, that would be an incredible online resource, but it would require so much more effort than we're able to manage with the staff that we have in terms of, getting permissions and all this other kind of stuff.
Right, and there's also, I think, a case to be made for you've sunk a lot of time and effort into creating really rich descriptive metadata for the pieces. So having the cover in conjunction with that would address, I think, most people's needs in determining their level of interest in the zine from online and then going to see it in person.
Yeah.
There's a question here about whether your discovery system is based on Primo.
No, I don't.
You said that you're using Summon, right? And I'm not sure what the relationship is there. All right, and then there's another question that says, I missed the first part of the webinar. Sorry if you covered this, but how did you choose JSTOR Forum over Omeka or Content DM or other potential platforms for putting them online?
Sure, this is a great question. So partially, to some extent, the decision was out of my hands. Not really, but basically what happened was I was considering Omeka. Obviously, that was going to create some sense of a learning curve and a bit more extra effort, but I was definitely intrigued by the possibilities of Omeka. I think at the time we were also considering like library thing, just creating like a Microsoft Access database, which, I did in library school. But kind of around the same time that this was happening, our visual resources librarian, again, was sort of evaluating different options for the in-house image collection of the library. So we used to have a custom database that was built by the IT department, you know, like 20 years ago, that held all of our instructional images. It was not great. The search capabilities of it were absolutely terrible. Like, you could search OCAD and get 2 results, which was it also had like all the archival images of the university, so there was obviously more than 2 images in there. So she was kind of going off on a search for various vendors and various options of what to consider instead. So at the time, she said that whatever option she chose for hosting the instructional image collection could also be used to host the zine collection. So ultimately, I decided that was a good idea. I think as much as possible, it makes sense to kind of group collections in the same access point, because as much as we want them to, users are always going to want one access point as opposed to, you know, going to this database or that database or whatever.
Right.
So it made sense to me to have multiple collections in the same space. And yeah, ultimately she ended up choosing ArtStore Shared Shelf, which is now called JSTOR Forum. So that is kind of how it went. And once the collection of instructional images was set up, then we moved on to creating the collection for the zines.
Right, and that's for anybody who isn't familiar with this, we were looking at the collection on Shared Shelf Commons, where it's publicly accessible by anyone. And then if you are logged into ArtStore and you go, you can find the OCAD Zine collection in the public collections list. So a quick way of doing this, as you can see, I was doing this earlier, was to just search for OCAD in the list, and if I scroll down here far enough, you can find it in the actual ArtStore interface as well. So when you're talking about that single point of discovery, students who are searching in ArtStore for images in the visual resources collection could also find zine images.
Yeah.
And then sort of hooking into that further is what you mentioned before about also indexing these in your discovery service. So
yeah,
there's some.
And then just thinking also about like longevity of the collection. If we're talking about a database that's, you know, put together by me, and then what if I move on and then that institutional knowledge is lost? Whereas if we're using something that is maintained on the tech side more by another entity, then we don't have to worry so much about, you know, losing that knowledge. Oh, this is a zine by a friend of mine.
There we go. Yeah, there's definitely a convenience relative to locally built solutions. Forum, for those of you who don't know, it's completely web-based. So it's also, if you are working with collaborative catalogers, they can sort of log in from anywhere and view these data records and interact with the back-end database, and then you can just publish directly to this front end. So that pipeline and the need for sort of transformation and exporting and importing is a lot simpler in terms of the collection management.
Yeah, I also like that you can set different roles for users, where people can create records, but they can't publish them, or they can only edit their own records. It kind of keeps things a little bit cleaner. Mind you, before this, we were like cataloging in a spreadsheet with like an insane, sorry, not insane, but just a very extreme color coding system. So this was definitely a huge step up for us.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of like workflow management that you can do, which you can't have with an Excel spreadsheet. As much as Excel is wonderful, there are shortcomings.
Yeah, we had migrated to kind of like Google spreadsheets because Excel would randomly corrupt the file, or there's just all sorts, like we were creating backups, but Excel was just proving to be less and less reliable. But yeah, even with the Google like possibility of workflows, it's still not as great as having this system that's kind of, you know, designed for you know, library or museum professionals to use.
Right. Okay, well, we're just a few minutes over the hour, and I don't see any more questions coming in, so I'm going to point everyone towards these various locations where they can find more information, either about Forum or using the handouts that are loaded in the go-to panel, further information about the collection and the learning zone. And I really encourage you to kind of look into the additional detail that Marta has provided in those presentations, because they're really helpful. All right, well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for talking with us, and I think we're going to call it a day.
Great. Well, thanks so much for everybody for listening in.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a good day.